Today we're going to speak about the most famous text, the most famous book of Hinduism, or the most famous book that's come out of Indian religions, and that is Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita, it occurs within the Mahabharata, as you probably read. And of course it stands alone as an independent text as well. As far as the dates of the Bhagavad Gita, as almost always with early Indian dates, it's tentative, and I think the book said something about, or someone said something about, by the 7th century of this era, it became most prominent. As far as how old it is, it's often dated to few to several centuries before Christ, and it's one of those things that no one really knows, and so they give like a ballpark figure. It's often within like 500 years. It's like sometimes within 500 years or 700 years or 600 years. And the truth is people don't really know. And that is because there's a very, as I've mentioned many times, there's a very ancient oral tradition. And at a certain point this tradition gets, the oral things get written down. People start writing. This is the new technology. And in a sense, for example, many of you were probably born in a world that had computers, even like personal computers, and myself being just a few years older than you. And when I was growing up, of course, there was nothing like computers or cell phones or long-distance phone calls, really. That was like a big thing when my aunt called from Georgia, and the family talked about it for years, all the way from Georgia to California. So anyway, with computers, it's a game changer. You know, computers are a game changer. Sort of changes the way everything, it accelerates everything, causes all kinds of sociological, psychological, cultural, political changes in the world. That's a whole other topic, like the interface between technology and everything else. But in a sense, you could say that writing probably seems like to you very simple, very low-tech, like to get, sort of to scratch, literally to scratch, like the Sanskrit word for writing, the verb is lick, like lickety, he or she writes, and it also means to scratch. So, the same word in Sanskrit means scratching and writing, because you would scratch the letters onto birch bark in North India or palm leaf in South India. But it was a huge technological breakthrough. I mean, we could talk about the printing press in Europe, and that's a whole other topic. Anyway, the technological revolution in Europe, which really got into gear in the 1400s, 1500s, the Renaissance and all that. But suffice it to say that when things started getting written down in India, you had this massive oral tradition, this very sophisticated oral tradition that starts to get written down. And what scholars are talking about is history in a special sense of the word. Because, for example, you could talk about sacred history. You can talk about oral history. But often when... still a few good seats left? Still in the first inning? So, things get written down, and there's all kinds of history. And after Newton, when everything has to be sort of empirically demonstrated, history gets very much constricted. So that when we say, let's say in respectable scholarly circles, when we talk about history, we're talking about a history which is very much empirically based. It can't be based on an enlightened spiritual tradition, or it has to be something for which we have documents. And so all kinds of stuff gets filtered out. Now, inevitably, when you have a sophisticated, developed oral tradition, very intelligent, bright people, in fact, people who are literally, without exaggeration, thousands of years ahead of the West in things like linguistics, which is the study of language. So this oral tradition is not just a bunch of people, kind of doing the ancient Vedic version of Kumbaya around a campfire and telling stories. We're talking about a people, a civilization which is thousands of years ahead of Europe in the study of language, and guess what? history is, something you do with words. It's language. And here are people who are the world's most sophisticated people in the study of language. The modern Western discipline of linguistics, phonetics, study of grammar, the morphology of language, all that actually came from the discovery of ancient Indian grammar, and an ancient Indian grammar that existed before there was writing. So, I'm sorry for harping on this or guitaring on it, but anyway, so I'll just conclude it. The simple point is that you have an oral tradition, not written down, which is being conducted and transmitted and governed by people who invented the scientific study of language. And they're the ones who are doing this word thing of oral transmission. Now, when it gets written down, at that point, it gets sort of frozen in time. So a post-Newtonian empirical historiographer looks at it and says, okay, this was written approximately within these 600 or 700 years. That's how precise it gets. So this was written within this 500 or 600 years, but when it gets written down, it gets into all kinds of issues. What if there were different versions of that? Whose version got written down? And if all the versions got written down, which version predominated? There's all kinds of politics and relationships, like who's governing. Like maybe the people who governed India, or had cultural influence in India, say 2,000 years ago when things were being written down, were not the same people that had cultural influence 3,000 years ago, and the oral tradition was very strong. And so things which are prioritized in the written tradition may not be the same things prioritized in the earlier original tradition. There's all kinds of issues which conveniently are not talked about. Anyway, bless you. So the Bhagavad Gita was written down at a certain point, and that's where it's dated from. And the extent to which oral traditions get sort of brought up to linguistic speed. In other words, let's say you have an oral tradition, which is 3,000 years old. And then 2,000 years ago, there's a problem because no one understands anymore, or very few people understand anymore, the language that was used 1,000 years earlier. For example, it's like the dirty little secret of going to see a Shakespeare play is that a lot of people in the audience don't understand a lot of what's being said. Because Elizabethan English in many ways is very different. Like Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, Romeo, doesn't mean where are you. It means why were you Romeo? Why were you born in that particular family so that we can't just publicly get married? Anyway, language changes, so there were certain texts like the original Vedas. There were certain texts like the original Vedas where the actual phonemes, that means the sounds, like say in the word sound, there's in a sense 3 phonemes. There's the S, like in sound. There's the ow, which is the vowel, and then, maybe 4, the N and the D. So those are all, the smallest possible unit of sound is a phoneme. And so in the original Vedas, like the Rig Veda, the actual phonemes were considered to possess the power. And I explained this once before, where there was an ancient sacrifice done by a gentleman named Twashta, in which he wanted to create a monster that would kill Indra, because Indra, the god of rain and thunder, Zeus, had killed his son. So this Twashta wanted to get revenge against Indra. So he chanted this in his mantra, in his sacrifice. He chanted Indra Shatru, which means the mortal enemy of Indra. And so the accent was supposed to go here, Indra Shatru, the enemy, the mortal enemy of Indra. But something happened, fell asleep at the fire, and instead he accented it here, Indra Shatru. And so Indra Shatru, according to technical Sanskrit grammar, means that Indra will be the mortal enemy of that monster. In other words, Indra will kill that person. So just because of a misplaced accent, they got the opposite result. So because of this conviction that the power was in the sound itself, the ritualistic Vedas were preserved exactly as they were. But the other literature, the power was in the ideas. Like, for example, the Upanishad. The power wasn't in the physical sound, the power was in the ideas. And therefore, since the power was in the ideas, it was important throughout history to express those ideas in a language that people could understand. And so what you get is you get a certain literature, and then let's say a linguistic paleontologist, someone that studies language will come along and say, well, this language probably dates to about 2,300 years ago, but we don't know how old the ideas are. We don't know how old the tradition is. And so there's something extremely tentative, if not recklessly speculative, about some of the dates you get in books. So I thought I'd just tell you that. Truth in advertising. So, any questions on that stuff? In the Bhagavad Gita is a case in point where obviously it was the ideas, not the physical sound, that had the power, as it does for us. I mean, after all, people have become attracted to great ideas. It's not so much the precise language, it's the idea. So, the Bhagavad Gita, the author is said to be Vyasa, which is actually his title. V in Sanskrit means apart, and Asa means placing. Vyasa divided the Vedas, organized, edited the Vedas, therefore he's called Vyasa, the editor. His name was actually, he's called Krishna. There are several people who have the name Krishna, also Dvaipayana, island born, because he was born on an island, not Capri. Anyway, so Vyasa, to show you how important the Bhagavad Gita is, in the Vedanta tradition, which we talked about, this is the intellectual major leagues, the philosophical major leagues of Indian history. The Vedanta tradition, perhaps the two most famous Vedantists, Shankara and Ramanuja, both wrote commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. They both revered the Bhagavad Gita as the book of books, in a sense. They both revered Krishna. And here we have the two greatest, you could say, philosophers who are diametrically opposed, in a sense, in Indian history. And then Madhva, all the great Vedantists revere Krishna and revere Bhagavad Gita. In the Vedanta tradition is, again, consists of explaining three sacred works. The Shruti, which is the Upanishads, the Nyaya, the logic, which is the Brahma Sutras, and then Bhagavad Gita. So it's considered to be one of the sacred texts that you have to consider and you have to align yourself with in order to explain the ultimate meaning of Vedic culture. So it's an extremely important text, and the last 1,000 years or two, a couple thousand years, it's just like, it's the book that people turn to. Gandhi, there's a quote from Gandhi saying that whenever things get really rough, I turn to the Gita. That was his book of consolation, his book of inspiration. So anyway, so what is in the Gita? The historical context is, as I explained last time, in talking about the Mahabharata, there's the Pandavas, basically the good guys, who are devoted to Krishna. They're the Kurus, the Kauravas, a great dynasty, but now they're kind of like the bad guys. They've betrayed Dharma. And so the Pandavas are now fighting to reestablish basically the rule of law. Ancient India had constitutional government, and the constitution basically was a system of Dharma. As we discussed in yesterday in the story of Mahabharata, where Shantanu, the emperor of the world, wanted to marry, because he fell in love with, a girl who was from a very low community, a fishing village. And yet, he would not simply take her. He was like 1 trillion times more powerful than this little fishing king, and yet he would not disrespect the father's right to raise his child. And so therefore he just went away and was miserable, even though he was the emperor. This is Dharma, Rama. Again, Rama, who had the power to rule, left everything and went to the forest. Why? Because he had to follow Dharma. And his Dharma as a son was to respect his father. So you have this tremendous interest in Dharma. And you find people in the Mahabharata, as I say, go out into the town square and criticize the government, insult the king. There's never the slightest hint that there's a reprisal. There's any kind of punishment for that. You can just go, it's not like off with their heads. This is not the kind of monarchy that we've been trained to despise as the evil counterpart of democracy. This is a constitutional monarchy in which people basically have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on. Yes?
Is there a hierarchy of, for Dharma, do you respect your parents before this? Like I know for Lord Ramachandra, he respected his family's wishes over, ruling the country. So in another, but then at the end, like he took to, like he banished Sita because of it.
Right. Well, in the case of, in the first case, he could only rule the kingdom with the consent of his father. Once ruling, then he inherited a new set of dharma, which is Raj Dharma, the dharma of kings. But he could not take the position of king independently. It had to be given to him, and it wasn't. Once it was, then he had to follow the dharma of kings, which might include subordinating your family's interests to those of the people. Anyway, so in the Bhagavad Gita, because I want to talk about what's actually in it. So basically on the battlefield, in the very first word of the Bhagavad Gita is, which we actually just read the other day in my Sanskrit class, the very first word is dharma kshetre, on the field of dharma. That's the very first word of the Gita, on the field of dharma. Dharma kshetre, kuru kshetre, on the field of the Kurus. Samaveta Yutsa, having assembled and desiring to fight. This is Dhritarashtra, the blind king, speaking. Mamaka Pandavas Chaiva Kimakurvata Sanjaya. He said, Mamaka, my sons and the sons of Pandu. Now by Dharma, the Pandavas were also his sons. Because Pandu, their father, was his brother. And so according to Dharma, when the Pandavas' father died, the Pandavas became his children. That was Dharma. And yet he didn't accept them as his children. And so, because the Bhagavad Gita begins with these words, Dharma Kshetra, in the field of Dharma, it's understood that those who actually follow Dharma, the Pandavas, are going to be victorious. And that's what happens. So, the battle's about to begin. The two armies are arrayed on opposing sides. And then in a very famous scene, Arjuna, who's the middle Pandava, sort of like the greatest Pandava, the great hero of the Mahabharata, he says to Krishna, Sena yor vayor madhye ratan stapya mechita. Please place my chariot between the two armies. So the tradition takes this as real history, but there is also a powerful symbolic element to it, in the sense that Arjuna is arrayed between these two powerful forces in the universe. And he is overwhelmed by sentiment, because it is a fratricidal war. He's fighting against his cousin brothers. And on the other side is the great Drona, one of the generals on the other side, who was his guru, his teacher. And Arjuna was very, very devoted to his guru. And yet now his own guru is betraying Dharma and fighting against him, out of personal interest. Yes?
What does the Gita say they're fighting about? Like their interpretation of Dharma? Or?
Because the Pandavas, by Dharma, were to inherit the throne. And the throne was usurped by Dhritarashtra and his sons, violating Dharma. And after that, Dhritarashtra and his sons tried many ways to assassinate the Pandavas. They tried to murder them in many ways. So they again cheated them out of their kingdom once they had regained it. So it was pretty clear, yes.
Were the Kauravas aware that they were violating Dharma?
Were they aware? Yeah, everyone kept telling them. But they thought it was a great area. I mean, why do people, there's so much white-collar crime in this world, and blue-collar crime, and every color crime, but people think it's a gray area. It turns out not to be a gray area, and they go to jail. Unless, of course, they can, what do they say? A good lawyer is one who knows the law. A great lawyer is one who knows the judge. So anyway, that's the historical context. Krishna declared that he would not fight personally in the battle, but he would drive Arjuna's chariot. And so this is very poignant, even though, again, this is taken as history, and yet it's a history filled with powerful symbols, because one of the oldest Vedic images in the literature, which I think I read to you, is that the body is a chariot, sharirang ratham, that the body is like a vehicle, a car, and within that vehicle there's the passenger, and the passenger is the soul. And so Krishna is driving that, and also the example of two birds in the same tree. So the idea that God, as God, is in the heart, which is also stated in the Gita several times. God is in the heart, guiding the soul. And so here you have Krishna driving Arjuna's chariot, and the chariot is an image for the body. And so you have this powerful symbolism going on. And Arjuna seeing on the other side his guru and his cousin brothers and uncles and brothers-in-law, I mean all kinds of relatives, and Bhishma, Pitamaha, grandfather Bhishma, who raised him. Because the Pandavas lost their father at a young age, they were actually raised by their grandfather Bhishma, and now Bhishma is fighting against them. And that's a whole story in the Mahabharata why even a great person like Bhishma was on the wrong side. I don't know, maybe you could think of him as the Robert E. Lee of the Battle of Kurukshetra. But anyway, so Arjuna has to fight against these people, and he breaks down. He thinks that, why, what are some of his words that, King no Rajena Govinda, what is the use of kingdom for us if we have to kill those whom we love, those who are dear to us? How can we enjoy the kingdom? Katang Sukina Syama Madhava, how can we be happy? And so, of course, he's missing the point, in a sense. I mean, these are natural human sentiments. Again, one thing that's to be pointed out, Krishna is urging Arjuna to fight. It's not like Krishna is simply urging the soul to go out and shoot people. This was a war fought between professional soldiers representing governments. It's not that Krishna is telling the soul just to go out and kill people. For example, in America, let's say if constitutional government was usurped, would you be satisfied or displeased if some people fought to reestablish the Bill of Rights, the Constitution? So it was actually a battle for constitutional government. Krishna told Arjuna to fight, and then he begins teaching the Bhagavad Gita. In the second chapter, in text 7, Arjuna formally surrenders to Krishna. Karpanyado, Shopahata, Sabhav, and so on. Arjuna finally admits that he's bewildered, he's confused about his duty. He doesn't really know what his dharma is anymore. He's a great warrior. He knows he has to defend dharma. He has to defend what is right. At the same time, he can't bring himself to fight against those who are so dear to him. I mean, the person, his grandfather that brought him up, his guru, his cousin brothers. And so he simply doesn't know what to do. So he formally accepts, he declares himself to be now a disciple of Krishna. Shisha Steham. Now you're just, because they were friends. Krishna and Arjuna were buddies. They were best friends. At this point, Arjuna says, I now accept you as my teacher. Please instruct me, because I can't figure this out. And that's really when the Bhagavad Gita gets going, after the beginning of the second chapter. So, I wanted just to give some of the basic philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. A lot of it comes in the second chapter. One point that Krishna keeps bringing out again and again is that actually we are all eternal. The bodies are just sort of like virtual reality machines. And so therefore no one is really being killed and no one is really killing, because actually we're all eternal souls. And Krishna defines eternality in a sense which is somewhat different from the Judeo-Christian sense. In the Middle East, there was a particular sense of eternality, and the Indo-European civilization had a somewhat different view of what it means to be eternal. In the Middle East, often you have the idea that, we don't exist, then we're created, and then we continue to exist. And that's what it means to be eternal. Whereas in Indo-European culture, even in ancient Greek philosophy, if you know Parmenides or Plato, and certainly in the Bhagavad Gita, we have always existed. We actually, as spiritual beings, we exist above and beyond material time. So even though we are now encapsulated in material bodies, we are in material bodies, and our bodies are interacting with the material universe, and therefore we are experiencing material time through our bodies. We as pure spiritual beings exist above material time. And therefore it's not that we existed a long time ago in the material past. We have just always existed. Because on the spiritual platform, there is no past, present, and future. Things simply exist. Parmenides points, actually to give a linguistic argument from Parmenides, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher, an important philosopher in Greece, he said that when we speak in language, say in English, we say the word nothing. So nothing is as much a word as something. But nothing doesn't refer to anything. And so because it's a positive word, we can say it came from nothing or it went into nothing. But Parmenides argued there is no such thing. There's no nothing to come from. And there is no nothing to go into. And things that have existed have always existed. In fact, physics, I believe, modern physics says, the conservation of matter, of energy. And so basically it's whatever exists has always existed. Even matter has always existed, but it's mutable. In other words, this chair wasn't always a chair, but the energy itself has always existed. And the difference between, and this is what Krishna is explaining, the difference between, let's say, matter, if we can use that somewhat pejorative term, dead matter, the difference between dead matter and ourselves as living conscious souls is that both energies, both the soul and matter, have always existed, but matter is endlessly mutable, permutable, you could say. It's being transformed into different things, whereas the soul is eternally the same soul. The soul becomes covered. The imagery that Krishna uses in the Gita is that matter is transformed into different shapes, whereas the soul is covered. It's like you take a diamond and drop it in the mud. It looks like mud, but underneath that mud is the same diamond. So if you think of all these self-help programs nowadays where like find the perfect you inside and all that, this was actually, the Bhagavad Gita teaches that we are all eternally pure, but we are covered by illusion. Simply have to remove the covering. So that's the basic ontology that Krishna gives in the Gita. Nasato vidyate bhavo. That temporary things never endure as such, like this chair. There's no way you could make this chair eternal as this chair. And there's no way you could stop yourself from existing. In other words, you can't kill yourself, really. We can destroy the body, which is an act of vandalism, according to the Gita, because the body doesn't really belong to us. But there's no way you can kill yourself. You can't destroy yourself. You will exist forever. So it's a question of existing well, in proper consciousness. So you'll enjoy the ride. So that's the basic ontology that Krishna gives in the beginning of the Gita. He says in many different ways that the soul cannot be destroyed. He says, for example, chedyoyam, the soul cannot be cut. Daihyo, the soul cannot be burned. It can't be dissolved. It can't be withered away. It's everlasting, unborn, always existing. He gives so many synonyms to emphasize the point that the soul is indestructible. Every individual soul, by the way, is indestructible. Then Krishna gives an example of how we can understand, sort of a heuristic example of how we can understand ourselves as souls. He says he compares the soul to a dress, vasangsi, just as when your clothes get old, you throw them out, put on new clothes. So the soul throws out old bodies and puts on a new body. And then Krishna says that even in this life, you have reincarnated. Again, I want to remind you, we're spending a lot of time in the Gita for several days because it's kind of the central book of the main religion of India. That's why we're taking the time to talk about it so much. Krishna says that you've already experienced reincarnation in this life because you were a child, and then an adolescent, and then an older adolescent, and then then you become what is sort of called an adult. And so on, and so we experience, and then our body gets old, so we experience these different bodies. It's not that your infant's body just stretched into your adult body. It's a different body. We are what we eat. We're actually recreating our body every day as we eat. And so the skin, the flesh, the hair that we now are displaying to the world, it's not the same flesh and hair we had a while ago. In fact, the skin only takes about 2 weeks. The skin only takes about 2 weeks, so it's literally, you get re-skinned every couple weeks. Re-fleshed, and the word karne means flesh, so reincarnated. So Krishna, he argues that we reincarnate several times in this body, and yet there's a continuous person. We understand it's still me. In fact, we say, I was a child, I was 3, I was 5, I was 10 years old, and we say it was me, and yet the body's different. So this is an example Krishna uses to try to get at this truth of the permanence of the soul through the changes of the body. And all this is in the second chapter, actually, if you read it. So that goes up from about verses 11 to 30. Krishna's talking about that ontology, the soul and matter, the body. And then in shifts gears in 31 and 38, he tells Arjuna that even from the point of view of Dharma, never mind spiritual philosophy, just from the point of view of Dharma, you should engage in this warfare because you're a kshatriya, you're a warrior, and so on. Any questions on this so far, by the way? Yes.
What about the concept of age? Like,
Age?
yeah, was it like important in Vedic times? Like, I know like the whole idea of respecting elders, but if the soul existed eternally, how did they treat like the age of the body?
Well, there's two levels of justice. Because on the one hand, if you accept the law of karma, you can just walk out on the street shooting people, and you could reason, well, if it wasn't that person's karma, I couldn't have killed them. And so I'm doing nothing more or less than just serving as an instrument of God and giving people the karma they would have gotten anyway. I mean, clearly you can't really organize a society like that. So, the basic principle in this culture is that we have to treat people fairly and justly according to their behavior in this world, in this life. And that karma will just, that's in God's hands. So there were the normal, also in a culture like that, I mean, hopefully older people have learned something, and so there was this, respect your elders, they had all that stuff too. But in this case, the elders were betraying Dharma, and therefore they sort of lost their status as elders because they were, it's like you respect your elders, but if one of your elders is trying to burn your house down or abuse your children, then it's like, it's not, you have to do what you have to do. Yes?
I read in the book, and I've read before, that Gandhi, he took, from the Gita, he thought it was a message of peace, like of being peaceful, and I've never understood how he took that out from the...
Krishna does use the word ahimsa in the Bhagavad Gita. Gandhi was not really a scholar, and that's a whole topic, Mohandas Gandhi. And the Bhagavad Gita does advocate peace, but it also advocates one's duty. So you could try to run a country where you just kind of, put out good vibrations, no army, no police, just the leaders of the country just kind of meditate and try to sort of, through the power of good vibrations, get everyone to do the right thing. And if someone invades your country, you just kind of meditate harder. It's an interesting idea. I don't think you would actually run a country like that. And so Gandhi, it was Gandhi facing the British Empire, basically, he mobilized all these powerful symbols of Indian civilization and probably chose the one tactic that would have, in a sense, worked, given the situation in India at the time. Although there is significant historical evidence that Gandhi wouldn't have been successful had it not been for much less peaceful resistance movements being organized by other Indian leaders such as Netaji, Subhash Chandra Bose, and so on, who had a very non-violent resistance against the British. And so also the British were basically, they were crippled by World War II. There were all kinds of resistances going on, and so Gandhi certainly had a powerful effect. But soon after independence, India was invaded by China. And so, real world. What would you do if someone was attacking someone you loved, or someone you didn't love, just an innocent person? If you saw an entirely innocent person being attacked, and you had the power to stop the attacker, but you could only do so through the exercise of force and violence, would you stop the attack or allow an innocent person to be harmed or possibly killed? So there's no question, according to the Bhagavad Gita, you have a moral responsibility, if you are able to do so, to stop the abuse of innocent people, if you have the power to do so. Anyway, the Bhagavad Gita makes a very strong critique of the Vedas. And by the Vedas now I mean the rituals that are meant to give you material benefits. Because the Gita is a spiritual work. It's trying to persuade you that your real self-interest lies beyond your body. Like, take care of your body, have a healthy body. But your ultimate self-interest lies in you, the eternal soul. That's really your ultimate self-interest. And so those portions of the Vedas which say perform this ritual and get this material thing, that's not the real point. So, for example, in the second chapter of the Gita, Krishna says that there are people he calls Veda Vadarata, simply dedicated to the technical words of the Vedas, and who claim that there's nothing more to the Vedas than to get material things, talking about the Mimamsa people. The Gita is also famous as a synthesis of all these things. I mean, maybe I'll just say a word about this, then get back to the critique of the Vedas. For example, Buddhism was a prominent intellectual trend in India. And so in the Gita, Krishna several times uses the term Brahma Nirvana. Brahma Nirvana. Now the Buddhist nirvana, just the word nirvana, that explains a negative term. Nir means without. So if you say our goal is to get rid of vana, which is the current of material life, and what do you want to get? That's still being worked out 2,500 years later. But what Krishna said is that you transcend vana, or the current of material existence, birth and death, suffering, by reaching the absolute. So it's a very positive notion. Brahma Nirvana. Or, for example, as we'll find later, yoga was going on in India. Yoga. And generally, yoga as a practice went along with Sankhya, which is a type of sort of philosophical analysis of the world. So people that practice yoga tended to understand life through Sankhya, in terms of the soul and the body and so on. Krishna also uses the term Sankhya in yoga. So he's really bringing together, and of course people were reading the Vedas and performing rituals to get material things, and Krishna addresses that. So the Bhagavad Gita really addresses everything. It addresses the whole universe of religiosity, all the different approaches, and somehow integrates them and shows that according to the Gita, that all these things culminate in pure love of God. And that's really the perfection of all these different things, is to understand yourself as an eternal soul and to realize your eternal identity on the eternal platform. So that's what the Bhagavad Gita does. And perhaps for that reason also it became the most important book, because it's the great synthesis of everything. And it doesn't merely synthesize, at the same time it points to the ultimate goal as bhakti, or devotion, love of God. But a love of God which is, I want to say, philosophically sophisticated. It's pious, but also involves, it also involves Shankara's understanding of the ultimate oneness of things. Things are one, and yet there's variety at the same time. So you love everything because you're not different from it, just as you love yourself. There's a natural self-love, which is not merely vanity. It's kind of like a precondition to be a strong, healthy person. Is you have to have some kind of, otherwise why would you bother defending yourself? Why would you, if you got wounded, why would you bother treating your wound? Why would you bother stopping at a red light? Why would you bother doing anything to keep yourself physically or emotionally healthy if at some level you didn't highly value yourself? And so here we're not talking about a type of crass vanity or egotism, but I think sort of, according to the Gita, sort of a justifiable, profound self-love. And according to Krishna, there's another book called Bhagavad, in which Krishna explains that we love ourselves ultimately. We love ourselves because we are part of the absolute truth. And therefore, because we love that supreme, and we are part of that, we love the absolute, we love ourselves, we love everything. And so ultimately we see everything as one, not in the sense that there's no variety, but in the sense that everything is intimately, inseparably connected, even as everything is individual. It's like if you think of a perfect relationship. I mean, think of a perfect relationship where it's neither codependent, where the people lose themselves, nor is it alienated, where the people just aren't really intimate. There's intimacy, there's oneness, at the same time people don't lose themselves. It's just the nature of a healthy relationship. And so what Krishna's teaching is that's the nature of a healthy relationship between you and the universe. You are one with the universe, but you're an individual. You have value as you. Or you're one with God, and yet you have value as an individual soul. And so Krishna is, and that's why Shankara glorifies Krishna in the Gita, and Ramanuja, and Madhva, basically all the great teachers, because it just incorporates all these elements and makes a very powerful critique of the materialistic performance of Vedic rituals. Krishna said that when you really become intelligent, when you really kind of clear up your head, you'll see that the temporary results of these rituals are not really the goal of life. The goal of life is something permanent. Anyway, all these things, there's so much in the second chapter of the Gita. Any questions on these points? Like so many points. I'm just trying to give a little condensed version of one chapter, but there's a lot of stuff in there. Arjun at one point asked for a behavioral definition. Arjun says, Stita pragyasya ka bhasha. If someone is really fixed in higher consciousness, what is their speech? How do they behave? And then Krishna gives, because sometimes people claim to be spiritual leaders, but then they engage in rather embarrassing activities. So Krishna says the symptom of one who actually is fixed in higher consciousness is that that person gives up all selfish desires. Because if you really see something higher, if you're attached to something higher, why would you still be addicted to something lower? In fact, there's one very interesting statement Krishna makes where he says, he talks about artificial and authentic renunciation. Where Krishna says that the Visaya Vinivartante Niraharasya Dehina. If you, for example, fast, this is the example Krishna gives. Let's say you just stop eating. And you find in monastic traditions all around the world, whether it's Jewish, Christian, Sufi, Buddhist, Hindu, yoga, in monastic traditions, fasting is used. Like you don't eat very much, or you don't eat, and then your body becomes a little weakened or emaciated, and lust, kind of, if you haven't eaten for a while, you can't just do it. So, people who are following monastic disciplines, trying to give up the world, sometimes they would just stop eating, and it kind of, it's one way to control your senses. So Krishna gives the argument that the problem is that, fine, but eventually you're going to eat again, and the next time you have a good meal, you're going to be like all about lust again. So Krishna says, Vishaya vinivartante, that the sense objects, the objects of enjoyment, sort of recede for one who's fasting. That's literally what he says. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinam. This is verse 259. But then Krishna says, Rasavarja, that the sense objects recede. Like if you haven't eaten in a long time, nothing's going to be very interesting to you except food. But Krishna says the taste, rasa. Like let's say, for example, you are looking for a romantic relationship, and you're really attached to that. It's like you just have to have a romantic relationship in your life. And let's say, for some reason, you're a monk or you're trying to renounce the world, and so you just don't eat for 3 or 4 days. You're going to be, you're not going to feel very romantic after fasting for a few days. But Krishna says that the taste is still there. As soon as you have a big meal, those desires they're there. The desires were weakened and couldn't impose themselves because your body was weak, but once you get strong again physically, the desire's still there. Mentally, you haven't overcome the desire. You just put yourself in a situation where the desire is sort of, just kind of suppressed for a while. But Krishna says, Rasopyasya param drishvani bhakti. But if you experience something greater, if you experience a higher pleasure, then you actually transcend that lower attachment. Imagine, for example, a boy and a girl going together, they break up, and one of them is like really grieving because they're still attached, they got dumped by their partner, and so, they're just suffering. And then let's say that suffering person that got rejected meets someone who's actually much better, much more attractive, much more intelligent, in every way better, and then this suffering person is not suffering because that person found something that they actually like much better anyway, someone so that, you couldn't pay them $1 million to take back the first creep. So the idea is when you have a higher taste, it's like when you were a little child. When you were a little child and let's say, we were attached to our toys, we just outgrew them. We outgrew them. It's not a question of renunciation. As you grow up, you find bigger and better toys. So the idea is in yoga or in spiritual life, if this is what Krishna is teaching, if you experience a higher pleasure spiritually, that's how you just outgrow material pleasures. It's not a question of denying yourself or renouncing them. You just outgrow them because you have a more pleasurable experience in the spiritual. And so Krishna is going to teach in the Gita how one, according to the Gita, how one actually acquires that higher experience, that higher pleasure. Anyway, so we'll stop here for now.